Hey, Jason, welcome to the DevOps Diaries podcast.
Hey, welcome. Happy to be here.
Very, very glad to have you on the podcast today, Jason. Jason, you have something of a DevOps pedigree. So I was thinking of a way to introduce you effectively, but I don't think I'll be able to do you justice and the amount of experience that you carry in the Salesforce ecosystem when it comes to the topic of DevOps. So for the listeners, I'd love your version of who you are.
My version of who I am. Okay, that's a. I will attempt to summarize. So, I guess I have been doing technology work, IT work for like 27 years now, something like that. I started out my career as a Unix admin, and I quickly realized that I'm not very good at operations and administration. I spent all of my time trying to figure out how to automate things. So then I got into building web applications and did that for a while, made the transition in 2008 to working for nonprofits, doing technology for nonprofits. And then in 2013 got the dream job opportunity to come work for, at the time, the Salesforce Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. And then that evolved into Salesforce.org, and then Salesforce acquired and became part of Industries where it is today. I will say that my journey to Salesforce DevOps was kind of accidental. I was a nonprofit tech geek. I was working in a nonprofit that I loved. There were tons of nonprofits using Salesforce. I had just implemented Salesforce. And it was really Kevin Bromer who hired me at Salesforce.org that had the vision, when given a headcount of 2, to start building out a product team around the nonprofits. What at the time was the Nonprofit Starter Pack, now the Nonprofit Success Pack, or NPSP. His decision, when given a headcount of 2, was to hire Apex developer, Dave Habib, who wrote Volunteers for Salesforce previously. And then myself as, I think my title was Lead Release Operations Engineer. And basically, Kevin had felt the pain of building packages on the platform and trying to build a process about it. I think he had written an article back in 2012 that's still up somewhere online. That was the article in the ecosystem at the time about how to set up Jenkins and Ant and build your own kind of DevOps infrastructure. So I came in, I had never worked with Ant, I had never worked with Jenkins, I had never built a managed package. I had limited experience with Salesforce. I really don't know why I was hired, but Kevin was the type of leader that would see something in someone and hire them and kind of challenge them. And so I was basically handed that and told, go figure it out, figure out the best process we can find. And we knew that we had NPSP that was used by thousands of Salesforce orgs at the time. And we knew that we had a bunch of other stuff that we wanted to build. That was before Education Cloud. So we had to, this infrastructure that we built up and the process that we built up kind of supported building up. I think eventually by the time I left, my team was supporting 50 different managed packages. We were doing push upgrades to 100,000 orgs every week. It was a pretty staggering scale from like where it started. That was over the course of 8.5 years in my time there. I got the opportunity to build up a team, so it wasn't just me hacking away and prototyping things. I'm kind of a prototyper by background. I'm not really, generally, I have not thought of myself as the person that builds, production-ready applications. I'm starting to evolve that. But generally, I've thought of myself as kind of a prototyper. I can get the thing working, but it might not be the optimal way to get it working. And I was able to build out a team of really great engineers that were able to take what I had kind of prototyped and turn that into something better. So what I loved also is that, as I'm an open source geek by background, I learned almost everything that I know about programming through being involved in open source Python communities, Django and Plone in particular. I learned about object orientation. I learned, how to think about software architecture just by looking at this amazing open source work that other people had done, trying to understand how they thought about it. And so I was really excited that, I had full support from my leadership that the tools we were building were really tools that just help solve how you do package-based DevOps on Salesforce. And we were able to make those tools available. So that's kind of known as Cumulus Suite or CumulusCI, and then a collection of web applications. MetaCI, which is it was the first one. That's the one that I built. I would recommend using GitHub Actions instead of that, but it was kind of our own CI system that we built on and ran on Heroku. MetaDeploy, which still today powers install.salesforce.org, that is used by tens of thousands of organizations to go out and install Salesforce.org's products. And then Mateco, which is a through the web open source package development tool for declarative users to spin up a Scratch org and capture changes to GitHub and things like that. So we built up all of those tools. We were able to share all of those with the ecosystem. And then my favorite part was being able to apply those with the Salesforce.org Commons. It used to be known as the Open Source Commons. I think they're just abbreviating it. It's still open source. But I don't know if you remember Travis CI at all from back in the day. At the time that Travis CI, for almost a decade, Travis CI was kind of essential to the open source ecosystem. They were building tens of thousands of open source projects and running all the CI builds for those projects for free. This was before GitHub Actions existed or anywhere that you could kind of get that runtime really easily. And there were a ton of open source projects that were just really dependent upon that and probably would not have evolved as quickly as they did if that resource didn't exist. So when we kind of figured out how to do package DevOps, and I talked to other ISVs and they were really excited about it, immediately my thought was, hey, how can we create more impact with this innovation that we figured out? How can we enable someone who works at a food bank that's built out a cool delivery tracking app for managing their deliveries coming into the food bank. Food banks don't compete, right? They just want to feed people. They don't compete with the food bank.
Share the good, share the wealth.
It's not their competitive advantage that they can manage their deliveries more efficiently than anybody else. If they've built it, they want to share it. But I think one of the things that I've continued to encounter that I think is a continued challenge of this ecosystem is I think that we have gotten pretty good at solving the DevOps problems for an individual org. But I think that where we still kind of struggle as an ecosystem is how do I deliver things that I built in one org over to a completely different org? And not rely on that kind of change set promotion process and things like that. And we really discovered that with trying to build the commons. We started running sprints. People would get together and they'd build this amazing thing over 2 days, but it'd live and die in an org. Nobody knew how to get it out of the org where it was built in and get it to where, it was a package and they could make it available to other people. So the Salesforce.org Commons continues today and continues to run sprints. They create community-run open source managed packages that are distributed through Salesforce Labs and available. So Labs is generally for Salesforce employees who build something that they publish out to the community to use, but Commons kind of uses that publishing channel in order to have community-led community-run projects. And to me, that is just incredibly exciting. That's probably one of the most exciting things I've ever done.
What makes that so challenging to develop these packages and then get them out to other orgs? What's the technical nuance of that?
The biggest challenge is really, in a single word, dependencies. Differences in dependencies and shape between orgs. Simple things like one of the first ones that I encountered, and it's just one of my favorite examples, and I still think it's kind of a silly thing in the platform. I kind of understand. But the fact that if you don't have a record type on account.recordTypeID doesn't exist as a field. If you try to deploy code that references it and the org doesn't have any record types on account, that field doesn't exist and your code will fail to deploy. That was the first deploy error I hit when I first started using Salesforce, when I first started doing this in 2013. And NPSP has code in it that relies on account record type. So trying to automate the deployment of NPSP, that was one of the first things that I hit. And I think that simple example highlights how the same code can behave differently based on the environment that you're deploying into. And so you need to be able to understand how those differences could happen. And I think there's there's two approaches to that. The first approach is I want to understand those differences so that I can try to extract them and sort of build the abstracted set, and then I can try to figure out how to deploy that over to somewhere else. The model that I've been thinking about a lot more lately, and I've been trying to kind of understand, how to describe this model that we work in at Salesforce.org. When I was at DevOps Dreamin' in Chicago, I saw Charlie Isaac's keynote, and he talked a lot about this notion of a digital twin. That and really what the notion of a digital twin is about the power of virtualization. That when you can virtualize something, you can then run all sorts of virtualized simulations in parallel. And especially with AI, that's the kind of environment that AI thrives in. AI is really good at, you feed it a bunch of decisions to game out. It can game out the decisions and let you know how the outcomes look. But the challenge is we don't really have there's not really a way to create a digital twin of an org. You can't ever create a digital twin of 100% of an org. You can create 99% of an org, 1% of an org, but you can never create 100% of an org as a digital twin. You can't create a 100% copy. And I would argue even a full copy sandbox isn't even that, because by the time that the full copy is created, it's potentially drifted from the state of the production org. New changes, new reports in the production org while the sandbox was being created might not be there by the time it's created.
Right.
And as soon as it's created, it starts drifting in state from the production org. So a full copy sandbox is the only mechanism to get an actual copy of your production org. So then you're faced with this challenge of, do you try to always work with trying to replicate that copy of the production org as much as possible? Or do you start modularizing your work and kind of carving out pieces of it and saying, hey, my favorite example lately is, say your company is looking to bring HR into Salesforce. You've been using it for sales and other areas. And, you're a bigger company, you have good security and privacy practices, and you really protect your employee data and your HR data. You're going to start pulling your HR data into Salesforce now, and you want to go hire a consulting company, a partner that works, that has experience with HR and knows the domain. So HR has found somebody and they go to engage them. So if the only place that development can take place in that scenario is in your sandboxes, and the only place that testing can really take place is in a partial copy or a full copy sandbox, as often happens, then if you're really locked down, you have to ship laptops to your consultants, and all the work has to be done on those laptops logged into the VPN so that they can get access to that really sensitive data that's in your org. The alternative is you say, hey, I want to start from a plan to create this feature in an org. And I want to build that plan totally outside of all of my production environment, outside of my data. And what I want, this partner to build is essentially a repository that I can deploy. And I'll provide you seed data or sample data, synthetic data in some way that you can work from. It'll be defined in the repository. So now the interface for how you work with a partner changes from, I need to give them access to my sandboxes with all this protected data and I need to really lock it down, to I need to give them access to a GitHub repository that has only synthetic data, has nothing internal, nothing sensitive, just IP about our org configuration. And I give them access to that. They can work in scratch orgs. They can spin up their own environments. They can develop everything. They give it to me. I manage the process of deploying and testing it. And it's kind of the difference in what is the source of truth. Is the source of truth the plan, the thing you're developing, or is the source of truth the org? And it's not to say the org's not important, but the org can't be the source of truth. There's no way to represent it. There's no way to clone it there, really. You can clone a plan. You can spin up scratch orgs left and right. You can spin up sandboxes off of a configuration in GitHub that you're building, deploy that into a sandbox. You can do that repeatedly. You can automate that process. There's APIs to spin up a sandbox and all of that. So if you operate in that way, it's actually really easy to promote up. If you operate in the other way, you have to do these really elaborate back promotion processes. And I see some of the conversations of this in the ecosystem, and it's and so I think the other challenge, and I've seen this also. There's a question of when you're doing development. Where is the development starting from? And one approach, which I think is kind of the classic approach, is I don't care about the dev orgs. I've got my pipeline of sandboxes. You spin up a dev org, you do whatever you want with your dev org. It could be 6 months old. I don't really care. You go develop the features, let me know what metadata I'm supposed to go cherry pick from your org. I'll pull it out and I'll try to get it into the pipeline. Then I care about all those orgs that are in the pipeline. But I don't care about all the development orgs and what shape they are or anything like that. And the other approach is, hey, I've got a plan that defines the baseline for everything that I'm doing in this project. As we make changes, we iteratively improve that baseline. So any new dev org that I spin up always starts from a consistent baseline. And I'd argue that if you start that way, it's way easier to capture the changes that you made if you start from a consistent baseline. If you're starting from a totally unknown state org, there's all sorts of things that you risk capturing from that org that you don't intend, that are more about the state of the org, like what pick list values were referenced in a record type. You don't care about that in the thing you're trying to deploy, but because you're not building in an isolated environment. You're not building in a stable environment. You're not creating those changes and then promoting those created changes. You're trying to kind of sync things between orgs. And I think that's the main disconnect in kind of the technical challenge. And you can work in your org in this way. Well Architected talks about this a lot with modularity and composability and packageability. And the cool thing is, if you build your org in that way, you're actually building your org, those little modules, if you did want to share with someone. I saw there was a Reddit post on like Salesforce Reddit sometime last year where somebody had gone through a 1-year implementation for their small business with a partner, built everything out in the production org. They got the production org. They had been using it for a year. They got like some big growth and they had the opportunity. They turned into a franchise business. And they now needed to duplicate the configuration of their production org.
Right.
And to me, I think that's a great example of adaptability. The whole adaptability notion in Well Architected is about, hey, businesses face new changes. I've heard, Parker talk about, hey, this was Salesforce with AI. Salesforce had to adapt to AI. This was a huge innovation, wasn't expected, kind of came up all out of the sudden. And businesses have to do that all the time. So if your business turns into a franchise business, you didn't expect that. You didn't plan that when you built your Salesforce org. But is your process built in a way, did you build that in a process that sets you up to be able to, kind of clone additional production orgs that have that same configuration or parts of that same configuration that are important?
Yeah, I guess the question I have, and maybe the listeners have also, if anybody's watching on YouTube, you're talking about modular development and you have what I think are modular synths in the background as well for music production. It's such good polarity between what you're talking about and what your what your hobbies are. If you don't say,
actually, I think the synth geek term for all of these would be semi-modular. I don't have any modular gear. Modular, you have to have a rack and individual modules. But,
yeah. Just love that similarities and just so good. If you're listening on an audio platform, go and check out the YouTube video after this, just so you can see what we're talking about. But my question would be, off the back of that, then, if you don't plan to become a franchise, but you do become a franchise, and you need to retrofit this type of process from your existing DevOps process, which might be more org to org based development. Where do you start? How do you do that?
I really, and I'll put this question out to anybody who's listening. If you come up with one, I'd love to hear a better analogy. But the one that I keep coming up with is the saying, "How do you eat an elephant? Piece by piece,
piece by a time,
or one piece at a time, or whatever." Like I'm sure there's a better analogy, and I would love, like I said, to have a better analogy. But I really think that that's it. I think, I was really involved with the SFDX team when Salesforce DX was coming out and in dev preview and during development. And I was really excited to be at the first Dreamforce when it came out. And I hung out a lot around the SFDX booth in the dev zone. And I was interested to hear what questions people were coming up with. And the biggest question that everybody came up with was, how do I get my sandbox into a Scratch org? Like, that was what everybody wanted. They wanted a Scratch org to behave like a sandbox. I think that's an example of everybody tried to swallow the elephant whole. I want my entire org totally in version control, totally. I think the better approach is, it's a process to get there. And you treat that process iteratively. If you can carve off 5% of your org's configuration, that's like a really important 5% that you want to be able to test and run a better process and have, quicker releases around and stuff like that. You can carve that off into a modular process. Now you have an org that's 95% still in your old process and 5% in the new process, and in a modularized process that's, more efficient. And you can then, as an organization, experience, is that actually better? Is that benefiting you? Or are you getting better, quality, better kind of feedback, better deliverability and customer satisfaction for your internal users out of what you're building there? And if you are, and that process is working, cool. Then you know what it takes to roll out that process. The one thing I can say is it is absolutely easier to roll out the second one than the first one. Because the first one's just learning. You're having to learn to think about an org in a different way.
Yeah,
I think Scratch orgs sort of force you to do that. One of the other things I find with Scratch orgs a lot, I love Scratch orgs. I think they're...
Me too. I think that's a debate sometimes still. I actually mentioned that in Texas Dreaming. I did a whole... I was doing a talk on Git, and I said I love Scratch orgs. That's a conversation for another time, though. If we go down that rabbit hole, then we're not going to get anywhere.
I think a lot of people do that. I mean, we were... At one point, our team at .org was like spinning up something like 5 to 10% of Scratch orgs on the platform in our build process, but also there were like thousands of orgs that were spun up by our internal users, by our product team. Our doc writers would check out a feature branch and spin up a Scratch org and use that Scratch org. The reason most people don't like Scratch orgs is because they go away. And I actually embrace them because they go away. Because I'll jump into theory a little bit, but one of my favorite kind of guiding principles has been sort of this joke, Siever's Law of Software Engineering, which was from Trace Siever, who was an engineer involved in Plone, one of the open source projects in the Python world that I was involved with. But this may sound kind of familiar. Plone is a really elaborate kind of enterprise-grade open source CMS. You can build a whole bunch of declarative applications. You can define content types. You can build templates and everything through the browser. So declarative users can go in and build full applications in this thing. But the problem is those applications that they built don't live in version control, right? They just live in the database of the instance where they were constructed. But you might also be writing code that you're deploying into that instance. And there's often a mismatch where the code behaves differently because of that declarative configuration that kind of just lives in one environment. Siever's Law of Software Engineering is persistence means always having to say you're sorry. And the point of it is when you rely on all that configuration persisting in an environment for your code to be able to operate and function, that disconnect is always going to cause friction. It's always going to create pain in the process. And the solution to that is get all of that configuration defined as automation and source control so that when you go to spin up a new environment, all the configuration goes with it. All the configuration that's relevant for the code to be able to run, to be able to be used, to be able to be tested goes with it. And if you don't do that, then you encounter situations where I spun up a Scratch org, it's on day 29, I've got like all this work that I've built in here, all this data that I've created, and I need to extend the org to be longer. And you can't. Like I couldn't even do it internally at Salesforce. Like it's not possible. You can't have a scratch org longer than 30 days. And we set our scratch orgs for dev to 7 days intentionally. We figured a week cycle is good, stay within that kind of 1 week cycle of work. But I set it at 7 for default because I wanted people to come to me whenever they wanted an org whenever they thought, I'm going to build this thing out. I need this configuration to persist for longer than 7 days in a single org. That's a great time to ask why.
Yeah.
Like, why isn't that automated? Like, if it's so important that you need it to be there, like, why don't you start just working on automating that configuration? And what's interesting is that when you learn the tools to be able to define that automation, building the automation is almost as easy as making the change in the org. It's not extra overhead. It's just working in a different way and thinking about the problem in a different way. The other thing that I think is I've been sort of seeing this difference between this notion of deployment and delivery. And we've thought about this, like I've thought about this in the ISV context of the difference between your package and your product. So I talk with ISVs a lot about, hey, your package source is in source control, but your product is that QA org that everybody in the organization logs into and actually experiences the product for the first time. Because the organization can't experience your product out of source control until it gets into that org because of all that other configuration that you don't have defined in source control. So it's not really the product until it gets there. It's not usable. It's just a bunch of code that's a module. But it's not complete. It's not a product. To me, the difference is between a delivery or a deployment and a delivery is if you have a post sandbox spin up checklist, that's the difference. Delivery or deployment is getting the code stage there. When you've completed your checklist is when it's actually a delivery. Right? If you order furniture and you ask for like home installation and they drop the box at the door uninstalled, in pieces, that's not a delivery. They just kind of deployed it to your door. They brought it to your home. But it's not complete. It's not in users' hands. It's not usable. And I think that disconnect is also a disconnect that we miss a lot in our conversations. So
it's interesting. Let's talk about testing a little bit then. So you mentioned earlier about, you used the example of the record type on account, for example. How do we build robust tests for delivery as like an ISV partner when you don't have that customer config ready to hand? And if we talk about end-to-end testing or any type of testing that encapsulates the full process, and this should work in production as it is working for me here in staging or what have you now. What's kind of your view on testing as a whole, and what are some of the things that you see people miss the most that would be a good place to start, even if it's not an easy fix?
Well, first I'll say the testing strategy section of Well Architected is fantastic. I recommend anybody, even if you're not an architect, it can be a little dense, but it's really, really, really great information about thinking about it. One of the things I keep pulling from there that I like a lot, resonated with me a lot, is this notion of that you need to know when you're testing in an environment, you want environments that have high fidelity to production. You want environments that are as like production as possible. And most importantly, you want to know what the noise is. You want to know what is not like production. What are you missing in your fidelity? And if you know that, then you can say, what I hear a lot is like, for instance, I can't do large data volume testing in Scratch orgs. It's true. You'll never be able to get a large data volume Scratch org again, I asked for it. I couldn't do it when I was at Salesforce. So like, you're not going to get a large data volume scratch org, which is not the nature of scratch orgs. Does that mean that scratch orgs are useless for testing? No. It means that they're not useful for testing large data volumes. But you can test 99% of your application's functionality with smaller data volumes. And then, and there's tons of value in all of the tests that you get with a smaller data volume. And then at a different stage in the process, sure, you run the large data volume when you get access to the environment to do that. But now you've carved off, 99% of your actual functionality, and you're testing that on every commit. And later, when you need access to an environment that has that extra fidelity, and that environment's more limited, then you can kind of figure out how you work that into the process. But the whole notion of shifting left, how do you get things where they're testable at the commit level? I've made a change. I haven't merged it anywhere. I haven't put it in a branch. I haven't put it in an environment. One of the other challenges that I find a lot, I come to refer to as the integration branch dilemma. And I think it's highlighted by the shift left problem is if you merge together 10 features in order to be able to get them into an environment to be able to test them. And say you have a release date scheduled, you've merged 10 features in, all the work's been done, and now you merge them together, you go in and you test everything. And release date's in a week. 2 features fail test. Other 8 are fine. What do you do? And there's kind of 3 choices you have. You can rush the engineers to fix those bugs and those 2 things and work them after they've already sprinted to get up to that point. You risk burnout and human error and everything. It's not a good solution. You can delay the release date. Nobody likes that.
The executives don't like that one, so
yeah.
that's pretty much a no.
or you take the risky endeavor of trying to figure out how do you unravel those 2 features and cleanly from that environment. Potential merge conflicts and all the different things that could go into that process. And none of those are good answers. Like the integration branch dilemma is a real problem, and I think it's why shifting left is important. Because if instead, before you ever merged it, it's just sitting there in a feature branch and it's got the ability to spin up an org and be tested fully there, then you don't merge the feature until you know that it's release ready. It's not development done, it's now release ready. And that's when you merge. And that's the gate. And you can operate in parallel so much better. You can scale so much better when you start doing, when you can just shift it out of that. But when everybody has to pile into that one branch or that one environment, it becomes a challenge. So I think that's a huge part of the testing challenge is testing. You have differences in environments. For ISVs, I felt like at .org, we did a really good job of testing our products themselves, right? We knew NPSP in an org, how it behaved, and we were pretty good about not releasing breaking changes in any of that. Where we did wind up into changes is we pushed into an org and there was something in that, or there was a trigger and it did something weird. And sometimes like if you have a validation rule, you can break my code. And that's kind of your fault for breaking it. There's nothing I can do to resolve that. Right. But it might be you have a trigger and that actually exposed some bug in our code because that trigger existed. There was that caused this bug, and we didn't see it in testing without that trigger at all. So there was an actual bug in our code that was exposed by some configuration in your org. And that's there's 2 ways to approach that. One is I want to get access to a full copy sandbox for all my customers so I can just go test the release before I send it out to them. And I see a lot of people reach for that approach or a developer sandbox or whatever. But I mean, the extreme version would be I want a full copy sandbox. I want to test it and fully before I deliver it into your production org. But I think that's kind of still a shot in the dark. Like I'm hoping that whatever I'm testing for is going to find the issue. I think the better answer is when you find those issues and as you're developing, you should be thinking about what those possible issues are. That's something that your developers need to be kind of considering is not just building the feature, but how is it delivered to all the different orgs, and what configuration might be in those orgs? How might that impact my code? You think about that, but then when you discover an instance in the wild where, hey, if there's this trigger out here, it exposes this bug, you can write a test to test your package with that trigger on it and make sure that you don't regress that functionality. So when you discover, hey, there's this thing in the org that can cause my package to function correctly, then you can actually engineer tests that test those scenarios and test the things that you want. I'm a big believer in test engineering. I think, hoping that we can just kind of like discover something is, I don't know, at least like from an ISV perspective or a product that you're shipping and selling to other people, like I don't think that's enough. Like I think you really have to engineer the test. The functionality you're testing for, the failure, the pass that you're looking for. Now, the last thing I'll say is, I think something that's really missing right now, and I would love to see, we sort of tried to do this with the robot framework integration in CumulusCI, was kind of my dream originally, was that we could enable our customers to be able to have automated tests of our product that they could run. So, we did push upgrades to 100,000 sandboxes. And we did that a week before we would push to production. But most of our customers didn't test in the sandbox and let us know. Like, that's the prime time for us as an ISV. I don't know what the answer is, but the ability for an ISV to say to a customer, hey, here's a suite of tests that you can kind of modify and mix and match. Say you've got a validation rule or a different required field or something like that. You can edit the data that's used in the test to make sure that it passes in your org. But just here's a smoke test of our product. And we're going to put this into your hands. You can modify it, you can edit it. And whenever we do that push upgrade, we really want you to run this. And, if you notice a new failure, please let us know. Like, we can fix it before we push out to production. Or we can even skip that release if it's an important enough, bug. But it's kind of the disconnected nature of ISVs. Like, you don't really have access to the customer's environment. You kind of need the customer to have that infrastructure to do that. Yeah. And I don't know what the solution is, but I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I think what I've found, and maybe not even unique to ISVs either, you talk about what you're talking about requires some level of communication and level of partnership, whether that be from an ISV partner that you're working with or internal partnerships between disparate Salesforce teams or testing teams or what have you. And a huge facet of DevOps isn't just the tools and the technology that we're working with, which we have spoken about a lot, but the process and the communication and like I said, that partnership maybe is lacking a little bit. Is that common? Do we need better communication as Salesforce professionals across the whole spectrum of what we do to be able to be invested in the success of these products or applications, if it's just a single org and big Salesforce team?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we built a lot of cool technology and innovation in my time at Salesforce.org. But that was all because of the people that were there and the way that we worked together and the way that we supported each other. I mean, I think actually there were a lot of accidental successes that I look at in retrospect. Like, if this happy accident hadn't happened, I don't know that any of the stuff that I created, like, there was nothing inherently special about me. I think it was like I fell in this spot, and the scenarios were, the environment was mixed for that. So one of those happy accidents was we were building the tools right alongside the teams that were using them. I mean, it was our friends who were sitting there using our tools, and when our tools sucked, they told us, and we fixed it because we wanted to, because it's our friends. It's not like, it's not a developer going through a support rep, going through a conversation, all the way around. Like, these were our friends right next to us, and we knew that these were our friends right next to us who were sitting there trying to, staying up nights and weekends at times, even though we encouraged them not to, trying to figure out how to make Salesforce more effective to create more impact in the world. Like, how could you not be inspired by that? And so, I don't know. To me, there was something really cool about that team structure and that communication that we had, and if we didn't have that communication and collaboration between the teams, for example, we started setting up. I think it was in my last 2 years there. We set up a CumulusCI Champions Council where we had one representative from every Scrum team. We had, I think it was supporting 12 or 13 Scrum teams. In addition to like a QA team that was separate, and a number of other teams, the docs team that was separate but kind of mixed in with each Scrum team. And so we had a representative from each one of those teams meet on a monthly basis, just to have a forum to come together and talk about the process. What's working in the process, what new things are coming out in the tools that we might want to try to figure out how to utilize, what things are coming out in the platform that might impact the tools and the process that we're using. Having that, kind of forum, I guess, in a broader sense, that's your Salesforce Center of Excellence, or maybe this is a subsection of a Salesforce Center of Excellence.
Yeah.
But really, focusing on that aspect of the process, and is the process working, and is it delivering for the organization what it should be delivering? What could we do to make it better too? If you have engineers in the mix, I think that should be just kind of innate in the way that you're thinking about these problems. I find, I guess, one of the biggest things that I guess chuckle about, and I'm guilty of it too, and I find myself doing this too, is that I find it funny that we often as engineers will spend so much time focusing on the architecture of our code and the thing we're building. But don't repeat yourself and all these principles of like really good software architecture. But then we don't apply those same principles to how we think about like the tools and the process that we're actually using to build that thing. And I feel like that's the biggest gap that we have in the ecosystem, is that there's an engineering gap. I think there's a lot more engineering that we need to do in order to kind of build the tools that pull all these processes together for everyone. And bring everybody into the process. Like, in regards to communication, if there's a single person or a single team whose responsibility it is to spin up and configure every org, sadly, this is often what the DevOps team is responsible for doing, is spinning up and manually going in and running through that admin checklist and handing it off to somebody. That's not DevOps. Like that's ops. Like that's admin. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's not, that's not to disparage it in any way. It's just, that's not what DevOps is. So I think that the key part of enabling communication across the team is to enable self-service org creation, so that anybody can go get an environment. Anybody can pull things in. Our doc writers could go check out a feature branch, spin up a scratch org, go into it and capture screenshots of a new feature that was being developed. The reason for that is because the developer, in addition to building the feature, also added to the datasets recipe to populate the fields with that, so that the screenshot was ready in that org that got spun up. So the recipe created a demo-ready org. And that makes collaboration with everybody a lot easier, because anybody can go spin up an environment. You don't have to go ask somebody. That team doesn't get bogged down around release time with all the backlog of work and creating releases, because they're usually responsible for that. And if you take that burden off of that team, then you actually have a team that can really focus on improving your process. But like almost every ISV that I've talked to, that I've worked with, if they have a DevOps engineer or a DevOps team, 50% of that team's job is manually configuring orgs, at least. And
that doesn't make people happy at the end of the day.
No. I mean, if you get hired as a DevOps engineer and you're spending a bunch of time doing manual operations work against orgs, you're burned out. And that's a risk to the ISV too. You burn that person out. There's a lot of critical knowledge that leaves with that person. Because this stuff is obscure and nuanced, and there's not a lot of people in the ecosystem that really understand, ISV packaging and some of these errors and, before. So, if you have those people, you want to keep them, and you want to keep them kind of engaged and excited about the work they're doing.
Yeah, of course. And that's something that I advocate for with any Salesforce team, is doing things and creating robust processes that make their people developing on the platform's lives easier, to keep them engaged and allow them to build build out that new CPQ functionality or build another application that's going to change the lives of their field service agents or whatever it might be. You know, those are the problems that admins and developers want to solve as well. Like, let's solve the painful stuff for them.
Well, and I mean, and this is just an aspect of leadership, which honestly, I didn't fully understand and didn't really click in my head until my time at Salesforce. But you can accomplish, I mean, you could be really good at prototyping stuff and doing things really quickly, but there's a limit to however much that's able to do. If you can focus on enabling other people to be able to do things, now you can scale what you're doing, and you can build bigger things and more complex things and more elaborate things. And that's really exciting to do. Like I say this as somebody that spent the first 20 years of my career plugging all the holes in the dam as the only person that's like keeping everything together, until I got burned out and left. And like, that was not good for me. It wasn't good for the organizations that I worked for. So really thinking about that process, I think that's another good kind of check. Like, we often use the you get hit by a bus analogy. I'm sure that there's lots of happy analogies, win the lottery and move to an island or something like that. But an organization has to be able to function without any of the individuals in the organization. Like, it's just kind of the nature of an organization. So when you're thinking about process, that's a really good way to challenge your process. What if this person were to take a sabbatical for 6 months or, go on paternity leave? Like, what happens in our process if that's, and that's a good way of kind of exposing where you've got people just holding things together for you. And those are great places to focus because you're burning that person out. You're facing risk as an organization if they were to leave or if they, go on vacation or something like that. And it's really highlighting an inefficiency in the process that if you focus on improving, you actually gain value from. So it's an opportunity, really. It just, shows up as kind of pain.
There you go. I was gonna ask you what you said as kind of a closing question or closing remark. What do you think the future of Salesforce delivery is over the next couple of years? But I think you've kind of said what I think your answer would be in terms of improving people's lives and processes and looking at those processes. But do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I think the I like analogies, and I think it, a lot of this is kind of learning to think about things in a different way, and a lot of stuff kind of filters from that. The analogy that goes back to the notion of a digital twin that Charlie was talking about. I think if you were going to start a car company today, you would not hire like somebody to build a prototype of the physical car that you want to bring to market, and then go pay a bunch of like high-end laser scanning stuff to like reverse engineer a 3D CAD diagram of that car that you wanted to build. Like, you just wouldn't do that, right? The technology exists now where I could sit, if I wanted to start a car company, I could, like I'm starting a company now, I could sit at my desk and work on my computer and design this car, run it through virtual wind tunnels, run it through virtual crash tests, actually drive it with a VR headset and like feel what it feels like, and all of that testing I can do before I ever print a real thing, because I have this. I start from a plan and I'm able to start from that plan and work virtually. What we do is oftentimes in kind of the Salesforce world, we jump into a car that's been driven for 5 years, has 100,000 miles on it already. And then we try to reverse engineer the CAD diagram that was used in the factory to build that car originally. And to some extent, we've got a lot of tech debt because of that. I consider all of that tech debt. It's a bunch of stuff that we don't know that we should know. Like, we should have the plan that was in the factory, but like that's long burned up and nobody has it anymore. So all we've got is the car that's been driven for 5 years now. And I think that when you think about it from that perspective, it kind of helps Well, okay, yeah, that does make sense. Maybe I should start my next project. Let's start from the plan. Maybe start in Scratch orgs, try to build it out, and then you print it. You see if you can deploy that to Sandbox. The one thing I can say from lots of experience in doing this is you're going to find 95% of your issues in that Scratch org. You might still have issues when you go to deploy that code into your Sandbox. But it's not going to be the major functional issues with the thing you're building and like the stuff you're really trying to test. It's like some little deployment issue that you've got to get worked out, and you'll get better at kind of learning those, those extra things that you have to do and how you deal with those issues. But now you have this way more flexible process. You've got the CAD diagram of your org and the thing that you're trying to build, and anybody can print a copy of it that they, and test it out and take it for a test drive for you, and give you feedback on it while you're building it, before you merge it, before you put it in the chain. And I think that is the future. I think that is what Well Architected talks about. That's the direction that Salesforce is trying to lead us. It's painful, and there's a lot of challenges there, and I'm hoping that there will be more innovation. I'm hoping to be part of that innovation myself with some of the product stuff that I'm working on too. In doing that, I think that is the overall path forward. Is you're not trying to represent the entire org in source control. You're building modules and you're deploying them together as a composition to create environments and configure environments. So yeah.
Jason, thank you so much. Some of us are off to go and start a car company now, I think. And yeah, those of us that are on their way to go and have a play, play with some of these concepts that we've been talking about today, and it's something that really lights my fire when we think about it. I speak very regularly to an engineer who works for one of Salesforce's bigger customers, who is all about modular development and trying to get their huge org into a modular work stream, and something that I'm super passionate about. But Jason, we can find you on LinkedIn if we have any questions. Your company, yes. MuseLab, is the name of the company that you run. Any questions, I'm sure you'll be welcome to field or happy to field.
Oh yes, yeah, I'm really active on LinkedIn. I love it. And I have a link on LinkedIn as well. I have a Calendly up with for 1 hour bookings. As you can kind of tell, I don't do short conversations, but that is truly open to anyone. I am really interested in hearing what challenges people are having with DevOps. Like it's useful to me to hear what these challenges that people are facing are. And I really love having those conversations. Just had one earlier this morning. So definitely, if you even if you totally disagree with me and you want to come argue with me, I love those too. So.
Perfect. Jason, thank you so much. And if you've enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to, on whatever platform. It really helps me continue to bring you guests like Jason here, and to hopefully start solving some of the challenges on the platform that you're familiar with, or open your eyes to new ones that you might go and solve. The right leg of the elephant, shall we say. Jason, thank you so much.
Thank you.